Right. Order. I'm on my feet. We come to the debate on the investment statement, Investing for Wellbeing. There has not been one of these debates in the last 8 years. The previous one wasn't debated, and I'm not sure that, in fact, that there has been one before. This is a tight debate on the assets and liabilities of the government and the management thereof. I'll call Michael Wood.
Mr Speaker, I move that the House take note of the report of the Finance and Expenditure Committee on Puna Hao Patiki 2018 Investment Statement, Investing for Wellbeing. Mr Speaker, I'm very pleased to lead off this octennial debate on the investment statement. And for members who haven't had a chance to review the statement thus far, I recommend having a good look at it. It was certainly a statement that the Finance and Expenditure Committee really valued working through, and I think the value of it, Mr Speaker, is that it's a statement which is produced under the Public Finance Act once every 4 years. And so as parliamentarians, it sort of lifts our eyes a little bit from the day-to-day, week-to-week, even the annual budget cycle, and asks us questions about how we are actually using the assets and the liabilities of the New Zealand Government to ensure that we meet the needs of our fellow New Zealanders and enhance their well-being. That fundamentally is about what the 2018 investment statement, Investing for Wellbeing, is all about. In a broad sense, it considers those assets and liabilities, it considers their condition, it considers how they are used, and it attempts to draw some conclusions about how they might be used in the future. I just want to read a direct quote from the summary guide that the Treasury produced around the investment statement, which I think sums it up really, really well. And it goes like this: fiscal sustainability is not an end in itself. It is a tool to support the well-being of current and future generations, including helping to achieve social and environmental goals. So it's a stocktake. What do we have now? The assets and the liabilities. And then, most importantly, what do we actually do with that? Because, Mr Speaker, I'm sure we could all think of individuals or companies or organisations who maybe have a good asset base, but maybe they don't actually utilise it very well. And the investment statement is about pointing us in the direction of asking the why questions. Why do we have these assets? What do we do with them for the benefit of New Zealanders? Mr Speaker, the numbers are quite striking, and let me just touch on a couple of those. They're worth going through to talk about the scale of the investments that the government has on its balance sheet. So as at the 30th of June, the New Zealand Government owned $314 billion worth of assets and owed $197 billion worth of liabilities. That's a net balance of around about $117 billion, which works out, if you average it out, to about $24,000 per New Zealander. Now, of course, these aren't liquid assets. It's not money that's just there to use, but it gives a sense of the value that we have on the balance sheet that we can, in one way or the other, utilise. 52% of those assets, interestingly, are held in the social portfolios. That's things like land and buildings, our hospitals and our schools, and the land that they are based upon. So again, not especially liquid, but they are major assets, significant assets, and we need to think about how we best utilise them. Mr Speaker, what's really important about the investment statement is it does give us that sort of intergenerational lens to look at these assets. And one of the things that that Treasury does when they are putting together the investment statement is to consider the resilience of those assets to shocks which might arise. And within the investment statement, there are a number of models in particular that the Treasury runs through to determine New Zealand's resilience to various shocks which could arise. So they consider, for example, another economic shock similar in scale to the global financial crisis, which of course hit 11 years ago now. They consider our resilience to shocks like a major event such as foot and mouth, an outbreak of that in the agricultural sector. And of course that was very poignant because I think the Finance and Expenditure Committee met with Treasury a couple of months ago the modelling around the foot and mouth outbreak was presented to us. And then, of course, more recently, we've had to really start to get to grips with an outbreak of Mycoplasma bovis, not quite as significant as envisaged in terms of foot and mouth, where they modelled an economic impact of $22 billion on the New Zealand economy, which would have led to a net debt increase of 22%, but very significant nonetheless. And it really does speak to the value of appropriate fiscal management, appropriate management of our balance sheet, because pretty quickly the government's been able to put aside nearly $1 billion to deal with that problem. So there we go, that's that principle of long-term, sustainable fiscal management, not just managing the things that are immediately in front of us, but being able to look ahead 5, 10, 20 years to the next generation to make sure that government is managing its asset base as appropriately as possible to deal with those shocks when they might come up. And of course, one of the major ones, just thinking of my colleague, the Honourable James Shaw, is of course the prospect of climate change on the horizon. Not just a prospect, actually a very real and current risk to New Zealand's prosperity, and something that we need to think about in terms of our stewardship of the assets that we hold. So those are the sort of questions that the Living Standards Framework does point us towards. It's also pointed out in the investment statement the state of some of the current assets that we oversee at the moment. And what the Treasury does is not just look at the age of assets, but actually undertake a reasonably sophisticated analysis of the condition of the assets that we hold. Really, it's kind of a bit of a check on government's management, but it's also pointing us in the direction of what we might need to do in terms of future investments. There are some concerns that come through in the investment statement. So at this stage, the Treasury is telling us that 20% of our hospital assets are rated in poor or a very poor condition. And again, that's not necessarily just about age. That can actually be about the state of the buildings, how well they were put together, how well they've been maintained, and ultimately how fit for purpose they are for New Zealanders to use. Treasury also noted in its report that 38% of school buildings and 25,000 state houses are older than 50 years. Now, not every single one of those is necessarily going to be in a poor condition, but it points us to a bit of a risk in terms of our management of that stock and the need for a forward-looking government to be putting appropriate investment in to make sure that that stock is kept in good condition for the benefit and for the well-being of all New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker. The next thing that I want to turn to in respect of the investment statement is really looking ahead. And there's a whole section, I think it's part 4 of the investment statement, which talks about the path ahead. And what it really focuses on is the work that Treasury is doing around the development of the Living Standards Framework. Now, this isn't an entirely new concept. In fact, the Treasury has already produced, I think, 2 versions of the Living Standards Framework. It's a piece of work which has crossed both this government and the previous government. And really what the Living Standards Framework is about taking the concepts in the investment statement, that long-range intergenerational view of how we work for the well-being and the betterment of our fellow New Zealanders, and actually really measuring ourselves against those things. One of the things in this House that we often get really focused on are sort of those short-term metrics that get put in front of us, and it's not that they're unimportant, it's just that they don't tell the full story. So of course every year we have the budget in this House and we focus on the bottom line numbers, the fiscal deficit or the surplus. We focus a great deal on GDP growth. But the work that Treasury is doing that's in the statement here around the Living Standards Framework really asks the question, well, what's that all for? What is the purpose of that? Are those the only measures that we can use to determine the well-being of our fellow New Zealanders? And of course the answer is no. You can imagine, for example, that you have a family that's on a very high income, if I can just draw a quick metaphor. But imagine that there's a creek running through the backyard that's heavily polluted and it's making the family pet sick. Imagine that a couple of the kids have got mental health problems and can't get the health that they need. You wouldn't say that that family is existing in a state of well-being, even though there's quite a lot of income coming in. And so the Living Standards Framework work being led by the Treasury looks at the broader suite of measures. It looks at our natural capital, things like our water resources and our forestry resources. Just think about the water resources and how reliant we are on those for our agricultural prosperity or for our power generation. We actually need to account for the value of those water resources. It looks at things like our social capital, the trust that we have in one another, the value of the rule of law that we have in our country, which has an enormous economic value in terms of the investment that we might want to have here. It considers things, for example, like our level of civic participation. Are we a successful society? If people lack confidence in government and our institutions and don't participate in our democracy. It looks at our human capital, things like our cultural attributes, our knowledge, our skills, and the mental and physical health of our people. and physical and financial capital. Things like, do we have fit-for-purpose transport systems, electricity networks and other core infrastructure? Mr Speaker, the words on the front of the investment statement are He Puna Hao Patiki, which translates as a pool for gathering flounder with a net. And this is put forward by Treasury as a metaphor for being a source of well-being. Well, Mr Speaker, the investment statement tells us that New Zealand has significant resources that with wise governance we can use for the benefit and the well-being of all New Zealanders. I'm very pleased to present the investment statement and the report of the committee to the House, and pleased that the Government is taking note of it in its development of the Living Standards Framework, which will form a key part of Budget 2019. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Amy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And look, I am happy to